All right, hi guys. So we're talking theory today and chords in particular. I'm just going to run through these chords in a bunch of different ways to sort of think about them, to build relationships with them and everything. So if you think you know chords, right, consider that you might not, and that you only know of chords and you don't really know chords like you know your friends, right? And so what I mean by that is that, it doesn't mean anything to say a chord is dominant. Right, from a real music standpoint. A real music standpoint is understanding the feel that it creates and how you would apply it in a song to make the listener feel something as they are hearing things and experiencing things. The listener has no concept of dominant. It has no anything like that usually, right? But they'll feel the energy as long as you personally have felt that energy, experienced it, and learned to apply it in your music, right? So when I say, do you know your 7 chords, right? What I really mean is, do you know them like you know your best friends, right? That kind of thing. Like, have you experimented with them, seen them show up in all these different places, related to them as, the 2 chord or like the 4 chord every single time, regardless of what key you're in, right? And really seen how the 4 chord shows up in all these different circumstances, etc. So to better understand this, we're going to go through a lot of different ways to sort of parse these 7 chords, right? How to identify them, those sorts of things. But first, I just want to mention something about music theory, which is that you usually will have to learn a subject in music theory several times before it really sticks. And that's because, again, you need this intimate, applied musical knowledge of something. It's not good enough to have an intellectual knowledge of something. You need like a personal, emotional, intuitive knowledge of these music theory tools, right? Like if you know what a flat 5 substitution is, more power to you. If you can execute one compellingly, that's a whole nother level, right? So we're gonna keep this really, really simple. You only need one note, just one note for your chord. You don't need a whole triad for your chords, right? This is mostly for producers. If you aren't a producer, forgive the next couple seconds, but you can think about like kind of the root of your chord, the lowest note of your chord, right? Just that one note is like the fundamental, and then all the notes above it are like harmonics, sort of, right? So it is sufficient just to have the fundamental in order to give the impression of the chord, or in this case, just the bass note. You only need one note, so don't make it too hard on yourself. If you're trying to learn to improvise and like learn just to try out these things, you don't need to be able to play triads, find them, right? Just one finger is fine. So if we were like 1 chord, 4 chord, right? 5 chord, back to 1. Right. Now what you'll notice is that the melody line pretty similar each time, but the chords give it a new context to rise in, right? So I like to think about chords as kind of like the setting and melody as like the plot, and setting really matters, right? If you think about all your favorite stories and shows and all those things, almost always it's the setting that really makes it magical. Whether it's Star Wars or Harry Potter or, I don't know, Downton Abbey or something. I don't watch that, but the whole setting of Victorian blah blah blah, that's what makes it work. So let's get into this. I'm going to like rapid fire go through a few different ways of doing this. Maybe rewind and watch again, like this part again. Again, you need to cover these things multiple times for it to sink into your brain. So we're just going to go through in order from 1 to 7, and then I'm going to jump around a little bit. First, let's go from order to 1 to 7. All right, the 1 chord. It is your major home bass. It is what's called tonic. When I say home bass, it's what music theory people call tonic. And it's feeling at rest. It's not going anywhere, right? In this case, it's major. A lot of people associate major with happy, but that's a little bit of a minimalization, right? Major, minor, happy, sad, that simplifies it too much, right? But it is major, and it tends to be a bright chord, and it's very harmonious, right? And this is your home base, which means when we are getting pulled back home by things like dominant chords, that's what dominant chords do. They'll pull you back home. This is where it's going to be pulling us. All right, our 2 chord. Our 2 chord, all right, so this is, if this is our 1 chord, this will be our 2 chord. All right, in this case, it's D. The 2 chord is what's called a subdominant chord. So it's neither at home, stable, and it's not going anywhere in particular, which is what dominant chords are. So it's not tonic, it's not dominant, it's subdominant. So it's not pushing anywhere in particular. This one is minor. The 4 chord is also a subdominant chord, but it's major. Let's stay on the 2 chord. All right. So the 2 chord, it's like probably the happiest of the minor chords, right? When we get into the modes, we'll talk about Dorian, but this is the one associated with the Dorian mode, which is the brightest of the minors. It's like regular minor, but the 6th degree of the scale, like the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, the sol, the la, that one is actually major, right? In minor, and normally the 3, the 6, and the 7 are flat. Dorian does not have a flat 6. So you have one less flat, makes things brighter, more harmonious, more happy if you want to really reduce it to that, right? Yeah, and like I get that I'm doing some rapid fire stuff, but like I said, sometimes getting like 5 rapid fire sessions, by the 5th one, you actually kind of let it all sink in. Whereas you can try and learn things once at a time, you still have to learn all those things once, 5 times over, like those one thing at a time. So we got 2 chord. Again, it's minor, a little bit more dissonant, right? But this is the happiest of the minor chords. It is subdominant, so it's not pointing anywhere in particular, but if it were pointing somewhere, it would actually point to the 5 chord. And the reason is 5 chords point back to 1 chords, and the 2 chord, follow me here, the 2 chord is the 5 of 5. So for on the 5 chord, and this would be 1, it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5 of the 5 is our 2 chord. So this, a common resolution, especially in jazz, is the 2-5-1. You can think of it as the 5 of 5, down to the 5, down to the 1, right? So it'd be like, right? You've heard that a million times. It's all over music. It's a common resolution, but the 2 pulls to the 5. So it's got a little bit of a dominant feel towards the 5 because it's the 5 of the 5, right? And 5s are dominant. We haven't gotten to the 5 chord, but 5s are dominant. 3, let's get on to 3. 3s are the trickiest one, so I'm going to talk about this in several bits, but we're going to start just little bits of detail. It's minor. It is darker, if anything, than our normal minor home bass, which is our 6 chord. All right, this one, right, it's got this flat 2, which makes it what's called Phrygian, which is like minor has a flat 3, 6, and 7. Phrygian also has a flat 2, so it's darker, right? And so you can think about the 3 chord as either your tonic Phrygian home bass, like this is the home bass of Phrygian. You can also, get this, think about it as the dominant chord because it's the 5 of 6, right? So again, 6, if 6 were 1, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 would be E. So the 3 chord relative to C major or A minor, right? You can think about it as the 5 of 6. So it's leading back to the 6. That's going to be really important. But the reason it's important, just really quick, and we'll cover it again, is 6 is your minor home bass. So if you're in minor, you're basically at a 6 chord as your home bass. The 3 will help you get back there solidly, especially if instead of the minor 3 chord, you make that 3, like the 3rd of that chord, sharp. Right? In this case, it's going to be G sharp, and then you have a major 3 chord, which you would not normally have. And see how nicely that resolved to the 6 chord? All right, so we have this 5 chord, this 5 of the 6. Like our 3 chord is in the major form, it's functioning as the 5 of the 6. It's like pointing right there, and then we get there. It'll still do it if you don't use that major chord. Right? But it's not going to do it as well. right? Versus this T, Do, right? So that T, Do, it's called a leading tone. And when you use a major 3 chord as opposed to a minor 3 chord, you have that leading tone, right? If you don't use it, then you would have, which kind of works. It's not as effective though, right? So that's the 3 chord. It can be it can be tonic in terms of Phrygian, can be dominant in terms of the 6 chord, going back to 6 chord, and it actually can also be subdominant when you don't use it like either of them. Like say I start like here. Right now, this is probably a subdominant chord, and then this would be another one. Right, so you can see all these have like they don't really point anywhere. Right, there's an upward motion. Right, that's another thing I might point out is besides the chord's personality, there's also, are you moving downward? Are you moving upward? And that's another thing that impacts the listener emotionally about your chords. And with inversions, like, you know, putting different notes on the bottom, you can kind of have your chords go downward or upward regardless of what the chords are. So that's just another thing to pay attention to in terms of how the chords make you feel. So it's not just are we on a 2 chord, but if we're going like 2, 3, 4, and then the listener expects 5. And now 5 is leading to 1. But you could also have gone to a 6. Right, or you really could go anywhere. But, you know, there's this expectation in the listener's ear of pulling upwards. And there's also a rise in energy because of this pull upwards, even regardless of what chords you're using. So you could start on a 3 chord instead. And we arrive nicely at that 6 chord, but there's this pull up to the 6, and then we land at this 6 chord, right? So don't neglect the emotional information of going upwards or downwards in pitch harmonically, right? And capitalize on that too. All right, so we've done 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord. 3 chord is tricky because it can be like subdominant, dominant, and tonic depending on how you use it and how you think about it. So you're going to have to experiment and learn about this hands-on. Like I said, you're trying to build relationships with these chords. Just note the 3 chord's particularly tricky. The 4 chord. All right, so we've done 1, 2, 3. Let's do 4 really quick. This one is subdominant. It is major, so it's pretty harmonious. And it's actually probably the brightest chord except for the 1 chord, which is kind of like, 1 chord's kind of like a campy Disney kind of home bassy kind of chord. Right? Whereas the 4 chord, it's not home bass, but it is almost brighter, right? If you know about modes, and we'll talk about this in like probably 10 minutes or whatever, but the 4 chord is associated with the Lydian mode, which is the only thing that's brighter than major. It's the only one of them 7 modes that are brighter than major. So if major is like, right, Lydian has a sharp 4. So if we started all white keys on F, we'd have a Lydian. That really bright 4. Right, so like Simpsons. Oops. Right, Simpsons is a Lydian. It's like, whoa, it's like so bright. And like a lot of times you're trying to like express wonderment or like amazement and things like that, you'll be in Lydian. So when you start on a 4 chord, you're in a really bright place, and it tends to me to feel like you're pushing in the right direction, and you can change that immediately. So you could be like, you know, right. So if you start on a 4 chord, right, it's like it almost begs to lift up to like a 5. And that would be a 4-5-1, another classic resolution. But watch what happens when I go to a 6 chord immediately. Now, the 6 chord is your minor home bass. So it's like we're starting in this bright, happy place. We're going right to sad town, so to speak. Right, so we're like, again. That's a 5 chord right there. And then back to the 6 as a home bass. We're in a minor home bass, right? So, but feel this 4. It's very, right? So it's like, 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 right? It's very warm, it's very uplifting, even if you go other places with it. Right. So 4 chords, especially when you start off with them, very, very empowering. They are subdominant, so they're not going anywhere in particular. But there is the 4-to-1 resolution and the 4-to-5-to-1 resolution, both super common. The 4-to-1 is called a plagal cadence, if you've ever heard of that. 5-to-1 is called a perfect cadence. But 4-5-1, like those 1, 4, and 5 are your 3 major chords, right? So all the super happy songs, they're often like, you know, like La Bamba and stuff like that. It's all 1, 4, 5 chords, right? Like. Right. It's all 1s, 4s, and 5s. And it's just pure brightness from all the majorness, right? So on that note, let's go to 5. 5 is also a major chord. Right, 5 is the major chord and it's dominant. We've talked about this, but dominant chords lead back home. So if we're in C, then we go to the 5 chord. It's got that T, Do feeling to it. Now the reason for that is the T is actually the 7th note of the scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Right. So if we look at that, that's B relative to C. Well, we're going from right, G to C. G's 3rd, right, its 3rd is B. Right? So it will pull you from its 3rd up to C. Now, part of the reason that works is because if you know much about overtones or anything, it actually, in the harmonic series, in the overtones, the major 3rd already exists. So even if you were to just play a G, it's actually got the frequencies of that B in it, right? Crazy, right? But even if it didn't, even if you were using a sine wave, it would still work because we are so psychoacoustically trained towards the major scale and the 7 chords and functional harmony and all this stuff, that when we hear a G and we're in the key of C, even people who don't know music hear that and they're so used to that G pulling that it'll pull, right? Now, it'll work better if you do include that B, right? But even if you didn't, it still totally works, right? So 5 chords, they're major. They really pull in a certain direction towards home. And yeah, the 5-to-1 resolution is like the most strong resolution there is. And remember, you often don't want to resolve, right? You don't want to like resolve perfectly, right? If you do this, the song's over, kind of. I mean, like you could do other stuff. Like you could then be like, right, and like having a whole nother section, but it definitely feels like you finished something. So if you're not done, don't finish early, right? Okay, 6th chord. We've talked a little bit about the 6th chord. It's the minor home bass. Now I'm going to go to a 4 chord, which is the subdominant one. Back to our minor home bass. See how at rest we are here? Here, it's like, where are we going next, right? It doesn't tell us where. But this, like we just sit here all day. Right, and there's never this like, I must leave. I mean, you might get bored of it, don't get me wrong, but the tension itself is not in the sound. So it's your minor home bass. When I say minor, there's several varieties of minor. We've talked about them a little bit, but Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. Aeolian is the one that we think about when we think about minor. Right, so that would be the minor key. So it's like the minor home bass is a 6 chord, right? You can recontextualize all this stuff and be like, oh, A minor is your 1 chord, right? And then you could recontextualize them. Then you have like a major 3 chord would be your major home bass. We're not doing that right now. We're only relative to C major is 1. Okay, Let's talk about the 7 chords. 7 chords are the trickiest chords. They are diminished, right? See how nasty that sounds? Not nasty bad. I mean, it's just like that tension. But you see how it also leads back to 1. 7 chords are also dominant, right? 5 chords and 7 chords are dominant. 3s are sometimes dominant, but 3s are dominant, especially pointing towards the 6 chord, right? 7 chord will point to the 1. You can also go to the 6 chord with it. The thing that makes a diminished chord diminished is it's the only chord that does not have a regular 5, a perfect fifth. It's got a flat 5. So check it. If we look at that distance, this is 7 semitones. If we go down to the B chord, this is 6 semitones. Right, so this is 7, 7, 7. This is the only one that's 6, right? You can see that there's 2 missing black keys, right? The B sharp and the E sharp, if you will. I mean, those don't exist. But the point is that same distance between white keys is going to be 1 semitone shorter because that extra black key is absent, and you can hopefully visually see on the keyboard that that's the only place it happens. That's what makes something diminished. Minor is a flat third will make a chord minor, but having a flat 5 will make it diminished, right? The fifth is very rock solid stable, right? It's the fifth is the first overtone besides the octave, right? If you're talking about harmonics, like the sounds that are multiples of the fundamental of your root note, the fifth is the first note besides the octave that appears, right? The first harmonic is the octave. The second harmonic is the fifth above that, right? So an octave and a fifth, right? Or 19 semitones, right? So got it? So when you have a fifth, you are basically reinforcing the stability of that chord, if anything. Right, so fifths are incredibly stable. It's very hard to upset them. Once you have a fifth and other notes, you play other notes. Right, that's a third, that makes sense. But I play a fourth. Right, it still sounds like a C chord. Now, if I took out this fifth and I played that F, it's actually going to turn into an F chord. Right, a very inverted one, but it's basically the C's become the fifth of the F, right? Right, as opposed to the F being the fourth of the C. And that's because fifths, like I said, are super, super stable. And so if you've got a fifth of an F, even if it's down here, it's going to stabilize your F because it's the fifth, right? Even if it's below it. So yeah, fifths are a force of stabilization in a chord. And then thirds, they're like the color, the major and minor color. And back to this 7 chord, this does not have a perfect fifth, so it's super unstable. It also has the leading tone. B itself is the leading tone. And I also would point out the F is a half step away from E. So it's got another leading tone, if you will, that is leading down to E. So it's going from the outside B and F down to C and E, right? So it squeezes inward and it's got that dominant force of returning. Okay, so we've talked about all 7 chords already, right? Quick overview. The tonic chords are the 1 chord, it's the major home bass, the 6 chord, that's the minor home bass, and sometimes the 3 chord, which is the Phrygian home bass. And if you want to make the 3 chords sound dominant, you really need to accentuate the fact that it's Phrygian, and you'll do that by playing that flat 2. Right, that F. The F will help lead it back to the 3 and give that sense of 3 being home. So that F will help lead back to your Phrygian home bass. Right, so I went from that 3 chord back into the 6 chord, which was the minor home bass. So all tonic chords, 1, 6, and 3. The subdominant chords are 2 and 4, and then sometimes 3, right? Depending on how 3 gets used, right? So subdominant chords, again, they're not pointing anywhere in particular, but they don't feel at home. The 2 chord is a little bit chill, but it is the happiest of the minor chords. The 3 or the 4 chord is particularly bright and happy for a major chord, but it's not at home like the Disney kind of 1 chord. Right. Yeah, so the dominant chords are the 5 and the 7. And you'll notice all these are thirds apart, right? And when I say a third, I meant 1, 2, 3, like 1, 2, 3. So watch. Tonic and tonic, tonic and tonic. They're both the thirds away from C. Subdominant, same thing. You go up a third, also subdominant. Right? Same thing with dominant chords. The 5 and the 7, you go up a third, they're dominant. So a third away is the same chord function, right? So you can group them that way. 1s, 4s, and 5s are majors. 2 3s and 6s are minor, and 7 is the weird one. So if you can remember that 7 is the weird one, the 1, 4, and 5. Check this. You can see how this you got like 1 and then 2 next to each other. It's the same thing but reversed for minor chords. The 2 and 3 are minor, and the 6 chord are minor. So watch how this is a mirror of this. Right, so all the major chords, all the minor chords. Right? Again, subdominant, right? Subdominant. Dominant, dominant. Right? Tonic, 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 tonic. Right, all thirds apart. Now, the 3 chord, again, it's weird, but remember, there's a couple things about it. It can sometimes be subdominant, especially when you don't use F. So I would argue that E in that context, the 3 chord there does not feel at home. It's being used subdominantly, right? Whereas if I'm like... It's like we're in Phrygian for a moment, and then I could go back into a D chord, which is our 2 chord, which is going to be another subdominant minor chord, right? It's going to be like free and easy, but like kind of dark because it's minor. Back to this 3 chord, which is now subdominant, and this is again subdominant on the 4 chord. And we're back to our 6 chord as our 1 chord. And nothing there was like particularly pulling home. The most leading thing that I did was this melody line, which was like, or right? It's like falling slowly. I'm like slowing down as I reach the home bass. So if anything was pointing towards that as your home bass, it was actually the melody line, right? So, yeah, and then the 7 chord is just a little bit weird, but if you recognize it as dominant and you start learning that dominant feel, you can totally use it as like a darker dominant chord. It's really not hard to use a 7 chord once you understand and relate it to it as dominant. You could even be in happy like major. Right? And then watch. Right, there's nothing like keeping you from being like here for a second. We could even go to the minor home bass instead. Right. So yeah, even though this is right, the dominant chord, the leading tones are all pointing towards the major home bass, you can basically always go to the minor home bass. Okay, a couple more things. So we've talked about the 7 chords. I've talked a little bit about how they're related to the modes, but this major chord, the 1, that's related to the major mode, which is called Ionian. Right, the 2 chord is related to the Dorian mode, which is like minor, but it's got a major 6th. Right, you can hear that 6th there, like Wicked Game by Chris Isaak, for instance, is in Dorian. Mad World is in Dorian. It's got kind of like this cool bluesy flavor. So it's like, what is it? What is it? It's actually in B. I just gotta correct for that. But yeah. Yeah, and see this note, that Dorian note. If you don't play that major sixth at all, you don't even know you're in Dorian. Right, so we could go like, but what if we're like, we could use this B flat, the flat six as opposed to the major six. So D is the what would be Dorian all white keys. The reason I bring this up is because the chord D as a chord kind of has a Dorian personality, right? Until you've played in Dorian, it's that only means a little bit. But again, I'm trying to help you build a relationship with these chords. You got to go do this on your own at some point. But the Dorian, it's a little bit gutsier and stuff than minor. It's a little bit less, it's got more energy. It's got one more sharp, so it's brighter, right? So Phrygian is one step darker than regular minor, and instead of, it's got the six is flat, but also the two's flat. So notice I'm using this E flat, or it's really a D sharp in this context. That's the leading tone to the Phrygian home bass, right? So you could even do that if you're in C major. You could throw that in, right? Like throw in like a, right? So you could play, even though there's no, E flat or D sharp, whatever, in C major, you could be in C major. And you could throw in that weird C chord, C minor chord. It's not the most graceful entry. It'd be better to do it from the 5 chord, which would be like a B major chord. It should sound really kind of weird, but right, and so I took us into E Phrygian for a second by using the 5 of the 3, which in this case is a 7 chord. I didn't use the diminished 7 chord, I used a major chord. And even better, if you know of your 7 chords, is the dominant chord, which has a flat 7. So instead of an 8, it's even more effective if you go. And then they'll pull you even more towards here. So yeah, 4 again is Lydian. We talked about the whole Simpsons thing and stuff. It's like brighter, it's like wonderment, right? The 5 chord is associated with Mixolydian. Mixolydian is like major with a flat 7, right? So if Lydian is major with a sharp 4, Mixolydian is major with a flat 7. Doesn't have a sharp 4, it's got a flat 7. So it's one step darker than major. Lydian is one step brighter. Mixolydian is like AC/DC. Almost all AC/DC songs are in Mixolydian. It's like major, but it's got a flat 7, right? And that flat 7 really provides a sort of gutsiness to it. It's actually also closer to nature, though our flat 7 is really out of tune in equal temperament. That's like a whole nother discussion, but the actual overtones and like the nice clean ratios are really generally the major scale, but we actually have a flat 7, and to be really precise, before a 4 ever shows up, it's actually a sharp 4. So like Lydian dominant is kind of the closest to nature for all you jazz theory nerds out there, but you're probably not watching this because you probably know all the theory. Yeah, so Lydian dominant's kind of the closest to nature, but some of our notes are out of tune. I don't know. We talked about 6. 6 is your basic minor, right? So your minor home bass. 7 is Locrian, and it's the darkest, right? It's the only mode with a flat 5. So it's like Phrygian, and then you flat the 5. So it's got a flat 3, 6, 7, and a flat 2 to make it Phrygian, and then a flat 5 to make it Locrian, right? So it's a diminished type scale, and that it has a flat 5. Right, it's hard to be in Phrygian and stay in Phrygian and give the sense of staying in Phrygian, because remember what I said about the 5s providing stability, right? The 5s, like a perfect fifth, not a flat 5. A flat 5 will not provide any stability, and that's all you got in Locrian. So Locrian, you have to do extra work to make sure you feel like you're in Locrian. I recommend using the leading tone. So in that case, if you're in B, You need to use this A sharp occasionally to kind of help you stay in Phrygian, or sorry, in Locrian. Otherwise, the ear will tend to want to drift somewhere else because it's like, surely we aren't in a scale with a flat 5. That makes no sense. Let's. Yeah, so without this, it's very easy for the ear to want to be like, oh, you're probably actually in C major or A minor, or even like potentially E Phrygian, because if you're playing these B chords, the B is the perfect fifth of E. Right, that T, Do. Right. So even if you're playing B Locrian, it's gonna like be forcing you maybe to E Phrygian, right? Yeah, so it's just tricky that way. Okay, so we've talked about the chords. We've talked about how to categorize the major, minor, dominant, subdominant, tonic. We've talked about how they relate to the modes and kind of the brightness and darkness. From brightest to darkness, let's do it this way. But Lydian's the brightest. That's the 4 chord. Then major would be the next brightest. Right? Then Mixolydian. And then it would be Dorian, Aeolian, which is the minor, right? Then Phrygian, and then Locrian. Now, if you've noticed, those just go up in fifths. So every time you go up in a fifth, right, for your starting point, but play the same keys, right? We're all on white keys the whole time here. Every time you go up a fifth and stay on the same keys, you drop one mode in darkness. So it doesn't matter if you're an F sharp major, and we go up a fifth and we play the same keys as F sharp major, right? Right, we got that flat 7 now, right? We're in Mixolydian. So we went from F sharp major to C sharp Mixolydian. Right, that flat 7. So yeah, every time you go up a fifth, you're dropping one level of mode as long as you keep the same keys, right? And if you're not, if you're going from C to G and you're staying in major, then you would have to add a sharp. Right, so it's like that added sharp that you would have added to stay in the same key will now shift you into a different mode, if that's helpful too. All right, so we've talked about the modes, how they kind of relate to the personalities. Actually, the brightest of the major chord or the minor chords. F, I've talked about why F is so bright and all those things. Is because it's actually the Lydian chord, if you want to think about it that way. And if you ever use that B, right, it's gonna sound that way. So we've covered basically everything that I wanted to cover. Even if you go outside of the key of C for a second, these principles still apply. Like you can move from C to like F sharp minor, but all of a sudden all the chord numbers are different, but they'll still work the way they used to, right? So like if I want to be, in C, and then I'm in A minor, I could go A major to, like, let's just say F sharp minor to like a D major, which is a 4 chord in F sharp minor, and then we can, and I could either let that lead me back to the 6th chord of A major, which is this F sharp minor, or I could use that as the Phrygian home bass, like maybe go up to the flat 2. Then we could finally resolve to F sharp minor, or to A major, which was the 1 chord. F sharp minor was the 6th chord. But most modern music kind of does this interchangeable major minor thing. I don't know. Adam Neely just talked about it in some video. There's some dude who wrote like a whole book on it, etc., and claims that that's why we've ruined harmony or something like that in like 12-tone meaningful temperament. I don't know. Anyway, so hopefully this was useful. Again, there's only 7 chords. It doesn't matter what key you're in. If you're in F sharp major, then F sharp is your 1 chord. Right. We've covered modes because, not deeply, but you can start in modes and just have that be your scale. But what you'll find is that, like, if you're in D Dorian, your 2 chord in Dorian is like your 3 chord in Ionian, in major, right? So the personality of the chords are basically the same regardless of what mode you start in. It's just, if you think about D Dorian and D is now your 1 chord, I just personally always think about D Dorian, like if I was in D Dorian, I would just think about my home bass as being my 2 chord, right? Right, and then this would be like a major home bass still. This is like 6 is still minor home bass. All those personalities are still going to exist to some extent. And you'll find that they arise a little bit different when you're in the Dorian mode as opposed to in major and using these chords. But right, like the 2 chords never going to feel like home in major, but it will feel like home in Dorian because that's what the home is in Dorian. So there are some little differences, but by and large, you'll find that the personality of these modes, as you get used to these modes, you'll feel the brightness. Like as you add flats, it's getting darker. As you add sharps or remove flats, it's getting brighter, like emotionally. And you'll find that relates to these chords, and you just kind of got to string them along in different orders and stuff. I guess that's the last thing I'll leave you with is the ordering of the chords. Or if you're going to use 4 chords or something, or any number of chords, it doesn't matter. But at the beginning of a phrase, like a short section of music, right, like the first half of your chorus or whatever, or just, one loop of chords, whatever, but the chord that you start with really matters. If you start off in a happy place and end up in a sad place, it's very different than starting off in a sad place and ending up in a happy place, right? And kind of the path you should traverse in between there, right, across the majors and minors and stuff, across these different chords is going to really match up to sort of what I think about as a plot arc or something, or like some kind of an emotional narrative. So definitely pay attention to that, where you start, where you end up, where you go in between. You might also pay attention to the proportion of major chords versus minor chords. Like if my chord progression starts on a 6, that's a sad place to start. But if I then go to a 4, a 1, and then a 5, those are the 3 major chords. Right? So I started off sad, but then all I've got is major, 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 like happiness, like, consonants. Right? So we're like, all right. And it's like so happy. It's like starts off. I switched the order of the 5 and the 4 or the 1 chord that time, sort of by accident, but it does illustrate a point, which is that time I even ended up back at 1 and it just felt natural. It was really satisfying, very positive, right? So when I don't use that resolution, it felt like I'd keep going. And even though I'm still in this, like if I loop through that 6, 4, 1, 5 a couple times, you'll notice that as I get back to the 6, it's like restarting this battle. All right. And I describe it as a battle because you start off with this tension and you got all this uplifting positivity. It's not just like a battle. It's like winning the struggle of life or something, if that makes sense. It's like very broad stroke painting of emotional ideas when you think about chords. So it's like starting this dark place, but we move here, right? And then we go to our happy home bass, but then we go to our 5 chord and it's like, no, we got to keep going. Right. So hopefully that makes sense in the ordering and the proportions of the major versus minor, right? You can start in a sad place, and that was obviously very important to the development of that chord phrase, is starting off in such a place of darkness, right? If I were to do a similar thing and start off somewhere happy and use only the 2, 3, and 6 chords from here, like notice how different. So we start happy, then we go to this place of dark, resolve tension as a 6 chord. But if I go like 2 and then 3, the 3 also, remember, it's the 5 of 6. It wants to push back to the sad home. But even if we start back at the 1, we loop back around to the 1. Just notice the plot arc, or the emotional narrative. So we're all happy. A little bit of sadness or something. 2 chord, which is the brightest of the minor chords. And then this, which is again going to lead us to 6. But I'm going to go to 1. And then I use that G sharp, that's the leading tone, to the 6th chord to really give it that minor feel for a second. And then I what to call the deceptive cadence is I'm pointing one direction, I end up somewhere else. Usually a deceptive cadence, you wouldn't go to another tonic chord, but in this case I went back to the 1. Right, and then that time I did resolve to the 6. Cool. All right, so hopefully that was useful. A way to think about these chords. Once you get the chords right, the melodies almost don't matter, right? Like if you get the chords right, the emotional content is there, and like melodies matter. There's like I'll do a whole nother thing on how I think about melodies, but to get really good at melodies, you want to relate them to the chords you're playing at any given time. So that's why it's better to start with really developing a good relationship with these chords. And then you can start thinking about your melody notes with relationship to the chord. Like if I'm playing a D chord, I'm not thinking about this D as a D. I'm thinking about it as the root of the chord I'm playing. Sometimes I'm thinking about it as like, the second scale degree, like do, re, but most of the time I'm thinking about it as the root of my chord, right? Because it's going to have a very consonant supportive feel with that chord. If I played E, that's not even a chord tone on a D chord. So it would be, right, that would be a 9. All of a sudden this has become a D minor 9, like add 9, as opposed to a D minor, right? So, but if that's a melody note, it's still doing that, right? Just because you didn't think about it as a harmony note doesn't mean that it's not playing a role in the harmony. So once you start thinking about your melody choices in terms of the chords you're playing and be like, do I want it to be a chord tone so that's consonant and that's supporting this chord? Do I want it to be a non-chord tone so it's colorful and is like, adding something new to it? And also some dissonance, because fundamentally the frequencies of those in-between notes are not going to be as nice as the frequencies of the chord tones. I think that's probably all I'm going to talk about today. Go practice this. Like just find a piano, find a keyboard, like do it on your computer keyboard. If you've got no MIDI keyboard, that's ridiculous. If you're a producer, you need a MIDI keyboard. You need to be practicing this stuff. It's the best way to get MIDI in the DAW. It's the best way to learn theory, etc., etc. So even if you don't consider yourself a keyboardist or a piano player or any of that stuff, and you're like just a producer, this is a vital producer skill. So get on it. And if you have any questions, ask me, right? Like, one, I can make videos for other people if I want to answer it in video form, or I'll just respond in text. All of the discussion aids the community. So please ask me if you have any questions and want some clarification. But a lot of this, you just have to go practice. As long as can label the chords that you're playing as a 1 chord, a 2 chord, a 3 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 6 chord, 7 chord, as long as you can do that, then you can start building a relationship with the 4 chord. Because every time you see a 4 chord, whether it's an F major chord in C, or whether it's a D major chord in F sharp minor, or like whatever it is, once you relate to those as 4 chords, every 4 chord is going to be the same 4 chord to some extent, and you're going to start knowing what a 4 chord sounds like in your heart, right? Like intuitively. So you don't have to be like, oh, I need a subdominant major chord that blah, blah, blah. Like none of that. You just play and it just comes out of you. You just like think, man, this section really needs to, let's start on a 4 chord. Let's start. Or if you're trying to build tension just before a drop, oftentimes like having that 3 chord, that's a good way to do it. Kashmir does that all the time. He's famous for it. which is weird thing to be famous for, is like Harmony 101 tricks. But yeah, okay, so love you guys very much. Hopefully this is useful. Get your hands dirty, right? Play it out. I don't hear, like, go to a thrift store, buy a shitty $12 keyboard, anything to just be able to go up and play stuff, even if Ableton's not open. I really recommend it. Be able to practice chords, melodies, harmonies, all that stuff. All right, I love you guys very much. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this gave you some kind of idea of how music works and harmony works. And I'm going to try and do more of these just sort of rambling theory videos. Because like I said, you need to learn things like 5 or 6 times, and for it to stick. And sometimes I think a rapid fire, like having 4 or 5 of these rapid fire sessions, like about the 3rd or 4th one, you're like, oh my God, it all makes sense now, right? But if you learn one thing at a time, you might never get there, because you kind of need like everything put together in one package, if that makes sense. So sorry about the long form, but hopefully it was high yielding for your time. I love you very much, and take care.